salute to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I forgot a roll call vote to open the meeting.
Oh, that's right, because Alicia's on Zoom.
That's right, exactly. Dana Packer, you here?
Here.
Jeff Walker,
Jeff Walker here.
Leslie Matthews,
Leslie Matthews here.
Bill DeMayo. And on Zoom is Alicia Greco, who's she's participating because of personal illness. And with us is Town Council Lisa Mead. So, the first item, the only item on the agenda is training.
Here we go. Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year.
And it seems like at least once a year we get to do something fun like open meeting law or public records law or something like that.
Good.
So Alicia asked me to come do a brief refresher on everybody on the public records law to start off the year. This, just so you know, is also helpful to us when if we have public records complaints, then we tell the Secretary of State's office, no, we're doing our training and everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing and we're gonna keep it up. So today I'm just gonna go through the public records law, and if you have any questions, let me know as we go along. So the public records law is found in Chapter 4, Section 7 of the general laws, Chapter 66 of the general laws, and the regulations are 950 CMR 32. And I'm gonna see if I can. There we go. All right, so what is a public record? So instead of reading this whole thing, I'm gonna tell you what a public record is. A public record is any document or text or electronic mail that you have and keep and create as a part of your role as a member of the select board, or that any department head does the same and keeps and creates, or any employee as a part of their business as a town official, right? So even if it's on your private email, so if you have a private email as opposed to a town email, and you send, let's say you send something to Tracy, and it's, are we meeting tonight and what's on the agenda? That's a public record, right? If you were to send something, if Bill was to send something to Jeff, it says, hey, are you going to that turkey shoot next weekend? And you guys didn't approve a turkey shoot or anything like that, it was just wanting to know if you were going to the turkey shoot, that is not a public record, because it wasn't something that you were doing in your official business, even though you happen to both be members of the select board, okay? So it's anything that you keep, do, write, say, transmit electronically, that is part of your official business. That's really broad, but those are all public records. And the public has a right to those documents unless there's an exception to keep them confidential. Okay, does anybody have any questions about what is a public record?
No, I just want to add that I pulled this up today, and it's put out by the state, and it's a guide to Massachusetts public records law.
Yeah.
And it's really good.
Yeah, well, that's right, we use that daily.
Right. It's kind of, it's 83 pages long, but I like how it's laid out.
So that's the Secretary of State's office who's charged with enforcing the public records law, and that's the guidebook that they put out to help answer those questions. And there's a whole series of question and answers in there, so if you just happen to have a quick question, you can find that question. It's an email I sent checking on something, the select board doing a public record, the answer is yes, right? So that is a very good document to have. But yes, that is, the Secretary of State's office puts that out. So what can be accepted from the public records law or a public records request? And that is what may be withheld. So something that's exempted from disclosure by statute. So for example, when the assessors get requests for abatements, they have a separate statute that says those abatement requests are confidential, all right? Because they have personal financial information in them. And so those would be exempt from the public records law. But what would happen is if somebody made a public records request, the response would have to say, I'm sorry, those documents are being withheld because they are exempt under the assessor statute. You'd have to say what it is. So it doesn't mean that you don't have to respond to somebody. It just means you have to tell them why you're not disclosing the documents. Personnel and medical files or information, those are all exempt, except that doesn't necessarily apply to law enforcement misconduct records, okay? So there are some exemptions for law enforcement misconduct records, but those oftentimes have to be redacted before they can be disclosed. So we always have to look at the exemptions. Records, the disclosure of which may cause an unwarranted invasion of personal privacy. Let's say somebody wanted records related to, wanted an arrest report that had information about a domestic case, right? So we might be able to redact the information related to the people involved in the domestic case, particularly obviously if it was a juvenile. But we would provide the record, but it would be redacted, and we would say why it was redacted. But there's unwanted invasion of personal privacy. Inter or intra-policy development memos. Those are not yet public documents until the final memo is developed. So if you're in the middle of developing a policy, let's say one of you, Tracy, maybe some other department heads are trying to develop a policy on urban development, right? And you're getting all kinds of information and you have various drafts of it. None of that is disclosable until the final draft is done. And once the final draft is done, the prior drafts are all available, okay? So those policy development memos, what the law says that they don't want to inhibit you from conversation and development of policy that may be controversial while you're developing it, but the public has a right to know, once it's developed, the process that you went through, all right? Personal notes of an employee. Let's say that Joy had to keep notes, so-and-so came in today, I gotta remember to make sure I put that in the schedule. Gretchen came up and asked a question, don't forget to ask Tracy about that. Those are personal notes. Those are not disclosable for the public records. Investigatory materials compiled by law enforcement. And so that's if there's an ongoing investigation. Those obviously, for obvious reasons, are not disclosable. That doesn't mean people don't ask for them. Proposals and bids before they're open, they're not disclosable, but once they're open, they're public documents. Appraisals of real property until a final agreement or litigation is involved. So if you get an appraisal for real property in order to buy it or take it or whatever, those are not disclosable until that matter is over or the litigation is resolved, if there's litigation involved in it. Names and addresses of applicants for gun licenses, interestingly enough, is not. Records of plans and procedures for security measures, obviously, there's a good reason to have those all confidential. Home addresses of certain government employees, okay? Not all government employees' home addresses are confidential. Certain government employees. Police officers are disclosable, for example. Judges are not. So we always have to look at the list and see whose addresses are disclosed. Regular, everybody that works in the clerk's office or in the treasurer's office, or those are all disclosable. It's all public information. Name and address of family members of certain government employees. Those are not disclosable. And trade secrets. If you had any trade secrets, those are not disclosable. So you always have to look and see, because there may be statutory exemptions, like all the juvenile stuff, that's all a separate statutory. The rape shield law provides another statutory exemption. So you always have to look and see, but otherwise everything is considered a public record. This is the case that I was just talking about. In fact, it was one of our cases that until about 2 years ago, it was always determined that the drafts up to the development of the actually intra policy memo were never public. That those are drafts, and they were drafts, and they could even be, thrown away. But the final policy is what mattered. But 2 years ago, the Secretary of State's office made a determination that no, all of the drafts are available once the final document is made available too. So that was a case that happened 2 years ago. every town has to have a records access officer. So you have Tracy, Gretchen, and Chief Fisher are your records access officers. And the name and title of those people and how to get a hold of them are on the website. It's all available for the public, so the public knows how to get in touch with the records access officer. Just because you're a records access officer doesn't mean you're not necessarily a custodian of the records, because different people are custodians, but the record access officer has the best access to the documents and or the custodians. So that person has the following responsibilities: to assist the custodian of the records, to produce any records and follow the rules and regulations, to coordinate the town's response to the records requests, to assist the requester in identifying the records they seek. So a lot of times, the public comes in and they just know there's a record there. They don't know exactly what record they're looking for. So you can't kind of make a public citizen kind of flounder and try to figure out what record it is that they're trying to find. The record access officer is supposed to help them. So let's say I wanted to get a copy of a permit that was issued by the Zoning Board of Appeals, right? But I don't know what that permit's called. I just say, well, they were allowed to build their house and there was a hearing. I want to know what that decision is. The records access officer can't say, well, until you can tell me the name of the document, you're going to get it, right? You can't do that. So they're supposed to help facilitate making sure the person gets the document.
May I ask a question? The RAOs, the three that you mentioned that we have in this town here, do they have their own little bubble, or is all three of them?
They'll help each other out.
No, but I mean, for example, like if someone were to ask the chief for a record.
Right.
That might have to do with the assessor's office.
Yeah.
Would that work?
Well, every department head is required to help anyway, right? So
Okay.
even if the chief wasn't the records access officer, right? And somebody went in and said, I'm looking for a property record.
Well, that's probably a bad example, I
But
guess.
no, but that, my point is that they would be required to say, well, you need to go talk to the assessor or the town clerk, right? You have to assist a little bit, so it doesn't matter, but the RAOs are supposed to assist no matter what.
Right.
And that
And they're
doesn't
all
mean,
equal, they don't have a specific.
no, right, yeah.
Oh, I got you, that was my
Right.
question,
Yeah.
I guess.
I
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah,
If someone asks me for a public record,
yeah,
I should refer them to one of the
yeah,
access officers.
correct.
Not supply the public record.
Correct, absolutely correct. You are not responsive, and the reason is, in a minute, you're gonna see, they have a lot of responsibility. The record access officer has to keep track, I believe you actually have a database, has to keep track of when the record comes in, when the first response came out, what was responded to, when the second response goes out, and you have to have that all on a log, right? So that's why you don't wanna be responsible for any of that. The records access officer has to keep track of all of that.
Good.
And so, as I said a minute ago, they have responsibility for the preservation of records according to the applicable laws. They coordinate the town's response. They assist the requester in identifying the right documents, and then they document the public records request. So they're supposed to do all of those things. In addition, they have to prepare guidelines to provide anyone making a public records request if they ask for them. And the guidelines include making the information available, that they enable the requester to make informed requests, include a list of categories of public records maintained by the town, and it has to be posted on the website too. So the RAO has a lot. Yes, Alicia?
I have a question, or clarifying, if you could clarify, and maybe it's in the next slide. Is there a reason why this is important?
Because the law requires it.
The law requires it.
Right,
Okay.
because you can get fined, right? So you can get fined or go to court, or like if you don't respond in an appropriate time period, or you don't give the right documents, or worse yet, you give documents that are supposed to remain confidential, you have liability there, right? So if you gave documents away that included confidential information, private information about an employee, you have now just opened yourself up to potential actions by that employee, right? Or opened the town up to potential actions by that employee. So that's why it's important, because all the records access officers know, most times now, particularly in Newbury, we don't necessarily see the public records request. People know what to do. But they also know how to issue spot. So if something comes in and they're like, I'm not sure that I should answer that, it comes over to us. And we help provide an answer. We help get the information, or we redact the documents and we provide the response. Because if you're not going to provide a document, you have to tell the person why. Or you have to give them the document that's redacted and have to tell them why it was redacted without giving away what was in the document. So there's a lot of responsibility of the town. It's not just a regular, we have this in our file, we should just give it because it's a public record. Because what's in your file could have confidential information on it that could violate the rights of an employee, of a citizen, of an investigation, things like that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so a person making a public records request can do so orally in person. They can deliver it in hand to the RAO. They can deliver it by first-class mail or email or fax. However, the RAO is not required to take phone call requests, and that makes a lot of sense. But otherwise, if a person, I get particularly in, not here so much, but in some other communities, there will be a person who will come up and say, can I have this record? And then, somebody will get mad and say, well, why don't, put it in writing or whatever, right? But they're not required to. So what we've done is create a document where they write the request down, the person getting the request writes the request down and then reads it to the person making the request and has them sign it so that we know it's accurate. So they can't come back later and say, that's not exactly what I asked for, right? So we try to have some kind of record of it so that internally you can keep track of it.
So when does it get, I'm trying to figure out, I know, like if someone asked me something about maybe something that the building inspector might issue.
Mm-hmm.
As a selectman, someone comes up to me. I mean, my first thought's gonna be, why don't you go to the building inspector's office and check with Peter?
Right.
But is that actually a public records request?
It is. And so
Shouldn't that go to Tracy, let's say?
no, so what happens is the custodian will then coordinate with the records access officer. All the department heads know this, right? So if Peter gets a request, a couple things could happen. If you have the document imminently accessible to you, and it's a public document, right? Then you're supposed to copy it and give it to them, and then you can tell the records access officer, I got a public records request, this is who it was from, and it's gone, we're done, we gave it to them, right? So you keep track of it. But if it's readily accessible, you're supposed to give it to the person if it's easily done. But then they coordinate it. Everybody here is really good about that. People know, tell Tracy, tell Gretchen, tell whoever that they've gotten a request and they fulfilled it.
Public information requests or public request for information is that could be just that verbal act.
So there's two different things. There's a difference between a public information request, which there isn't really such a thing, or a public records request. And the reason this is important is as follows. You are not required to create a document that doesn't exist, okay? That's why it's called the Public Records Law. So you're not required to create a document that doesn't exist. This is particularly important for people who are doing...
That makes perfect sense.
Right, for people who are doing fishing expeditions, like national companies trying to get lists of things. We get requests in, everybody does, that a company wants to make sure they get bid documents or that they know how many, how many gallons of, wash you're selling, right? So they'll send a request to the treasurer's office or to the clerk and say, give us a list of all the RFPs you've ever issued for the sale of soap. I don't know, I'm making something up, right? And so you don't keep a list of that, right? You don't have that list. So the response always is, there are no public records responsive to your request, right? You don't have to go searching through all the documents and create a list, okay? So if somebody comes to you and says, I need something from the building department, I need a building permit, I need whatever, you say, go see Peter. That's fine. Or you can say, go see Gretchen, it doesn't matter. But you obviously can't get them the document, and you're not required to. Okay. So as I said, the RAO has responsibility. They have to document the nature of the request and the date it was received, the date response was provided to the requester, the date the records were provided to the requester, the number of hours required to fulfill the request, the fees charged, if any petitions submitted under Section 10 or Section 10A, these are appeals to the Secretary of State's office. The time required to comply with the request, with the supervisor's orders, and final adjudication of any court action necessary to that particular request. So oftentimes a request comes in and is voluminous, right? You can't just automatically respond to it, or it requires some research. So you have 10 business days to respond to a public records request. A response doesn't mean that you're going to provide the documents in 10 days. It means that you have to give documentation to the person requested that says, I've received your request, we're looking for the records, we believe it's going to take X number of hours to get your records, we believe it's going to cost X number of dollars to get those records, we'll give those records to you when we get them. And then you have 25 days to do that. If you need more than 25 days, and believe me, there are plenty of times that you do, we have to get permission to go beyond the 25 days. So there are timeframes, but you also have to remember that you don't have to stop all the work of the town in order to comply with the public records request. There are other things that you have to do. But the records access officer is responsible for all of that activity. So as I said, they have to be provided the documents, or a response has to be provided in no less than 10 business days following the receipt. And if they don't provide a response in those 10 days, they then can't charge a fee to fulfill the request, which is really important on really big requests because it takes time. It takes hours of staff, it takes copying, whatever it is. And so you're allowed to charge for those. But you have to respond within 10 days in order to be able to assess a fee.
Seems like a public record request has a lot of horsepower. I mean, what happens in towns that have, in the rural parts of our state, that have 5 employees working in town hall?
Yeah, so we represent some of those people, right, and some of those towns. And smaller towns, less records, right? So they're pretty adept at responding, or they'll reach out to us and say, help. We do a lot of all the responses for a couple of those small towns. And the Secretary of State's office is pretty reasonable about time periods.
So it can get expensive.
It can get expensive, yep.
Also, in this whole scheme of things, there's a lot of stuff that's required to be put on our town website, which I would imagine, if you just read through that list of the requirements that are supposed to be there, it really would have, in my mind, it eliminates 90% of the requests that you may or may not get.
Yeah, so
Because it's already posted and out there for you just to grab it, so.
yeah, but you should be careful of the things that say that they should be posted
No,
versus things that are
I said
required.
required.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's cut and dry.
Yeah, so-
What's required to be there.
So-
And I didn't say should, I
Yeah,
just.
no,
said-
I'm just saying, so for example, one of the big complaints we get all the time is that under the open meeting law, which then becomes a public record, the minutes aren't posted online, right? I can't tell you how many complaints I've gotten taken to the AG's office where a complainant says your minutes are required to be posted online. Nothing requires your minutes to be posted online. They have to be available, and it would be convenient if they're online, but they are not required to be online. So anyway, that list is a very helpful list. And most things are now available online anyway. So it has made things a lot easier, for sure. As I said earlier, if the town can't provide the record the records within the 10 days, they have to confirm receipt, identify the category of records and when they're going to be responded to and who has the records, right? So that's the responsibility of the RAO. They also have to identify which records aren't going to be produced and why. You have to say why they are, and if they're redacted, you have to say why things are being redacted. And then if there are too many records, you can't produce them because there are too many and it's going to take you a while. You have to identify that there are too many and it's burdensome. And so oftentimes the RAO will be asking requesters, could you be a little more specific here? Like, you've asked me for all emails from all town elected officials for the last 15 years. Do you really want that? Or are you looking for something more specific, like all emails around the Council on Aging about a building in the last 2 years? Well, that's a little more and then if you have, is there somebody you're looking for? Like John Doe, right? Give me John Doe, and then I can even, so you try to help narrow the request so it's not as broad. And oftentimes that happens, which is good. You have to include a good faith estimate of the fees that are going to be charged, and you have to always include at the end of every correspondence that the requester has a right to appeal to the Secretary of State's office. And that's actually a requirement of the law, and we oftentimes forget it because it's so easy, because you're like, oh, I'm answering. Thank you, Gary. Very regards, Lisa Mead. Oh, you have a right to appeal this to the Secretary of State's office. So even if you're responding and giving people documents with a cover letter, you have to include that statement that they have a right to appeal it to the Secretary of State's office. And we have forms that we've given all of our communities, here's the first response, here's the second response, here's the third response, just so you have them and they're easily pulled, and then they put in all the details that are appropriate for each of the individual requests. The RAO may also, as soon as practicable and within 20 business days after the initial request or within 10 days after the receipt of determination by the supervisor, petition the supervisor for an extension of time up to 30 days. So if you can't get the documents in that time period and the requester won't give you an extension, you can request the extension of the supervisor, and the supervisor typically will give you an extension up to 30 days. So what can you charge? You can charge if somebody needs to have something on a thumb drive, you can charge for the thumb drive. 5 cents for all black and white copies of everything, whether it's single or double-sided. You can also charge for an employee's time, but no more than $25 or equal to the highest paid employee able to respond to the request in that department. So if that pay is less than $25 an hour, that's the most you can charge for that employee's time to respond to the request. You can't, if you have more than 20,000 people, which you don't, you can't charge for the first 2 hours. You cannot charge for time spent segregating or redacting unless it's required by law and approved by the supervisor. And then fees may be waived upon a showing that the production of the requested records are in the public interest. Every newspaper in the entire Commonwealth that ever, or news station, which ever asks for a public records request, always ask for a waiver of the fees because it's in the public interest. It's like a thing that they have at the bottom of every letter they make. So anyway, you can ask for a waiver, but it does not have to be granted at all.
Who's the supervisor?
Secretary of State's office.
Okay.
Yeah.
So whenever it
But
says
it's upon,
supervisor.
right, so it's actually not Secretary of State, it's the head of the Public Records Division. He's considered,
Gotcha.
she actually is considered a supervisor. You can also waive the fee if the person making it shows the financial inability to pay, so you can do that. And again, as I said, no fees can be charged if the town fails to respond within the first 10 days. The public access records access officer may deny public records requests from a requester who has failed to compensate the agency or municipality for previously produced public records. So that's what the law says, okay? You don't pay me for the last records you asked. You asked me to produce this many records, and I've told you it's going to cost $110, right? So I've got the records all ready to go. You never bring the check in. You never come get the records. So I spent all that time getting all those records, right? So this says, if you failed to compensate the town, I don't have to do a public records request for you again, right? That's what this says. But that's not how they interpret it. They say that if the person making the request has agreed initially to make the payment, and then they fail to make the payment, then you can deny the request. However, the way the system is set up is that there's not ever, like, you send out the letter saying it's gonna take 5 days and it's gonna cost you $110. And then you're required by law to produce the documents and get them ready to go. There's never an opportunity for the person to write back or call up and say, yep, that's okay, I'll pay you the money, right? Never. But now we actually have now tried to accommodate that by saying, okay, this is gonna cost $110, you still want the records, and get a response back. Because otherwise, it doesn't matter whether you've produced the documents or not. If you've never got their actual acquiescence to the fee, then you can't ever stop producing the documents.
Are we required to give the requester the records if they haven't paid yet? Is that?
No, you don't, you're not required to, but the next time, so they sit there on your desk. Now you've spent all that time. I actually had this case, and I had a case where I had 2 selectmen in a very contentious issue. I had to go through and redact 2 years worth of emails, their emails, right? And literally, it was for a newspaper, and literally, I'm talking about stacks like this. And they never came to pick them up. And we did all that work, right? Never came to pick them up. Then made another request. We denied the request.
So the I'm trying to, just the 10-day limitation, then the 25-day limitation, that they just have to be available to the
Right.
requestee within that time period.
Correct.
But we don't necessarily have to.
You can't make them.
Mail them or
No,
send them
they have to
out.
be available. In fact, if people owe money, no, they gotta come pick up the
Okay,
document.
that's what I.
Yeah, no.
Gotcha.
Right. Okay, so, there is a harassment provision in the law that says, basically, if the magnitude or difficulty of the request or the receipt of multiple requests from the same requester is unduly burdensome and unduly burdens the other responsibilities of the municipality, a records access officer may petition the supervisor of records that they don't have to continue responding to these requests, right? There's been one case in Massachusetts where this has been applied, notwithstanding the claims for harassment. And it was in Wellesley. And there was a guy who was a perpetual harassing public records requester. And then he was just awful. And he was also making requests of one of my towns. And so like we're watching. And they kept trying to get the Secretary of State's office to say he's harassing, because he was asked, it was just ridiculous stuff. It didn't seem to be there was any purpose, even though that's not one of the standards. And he finally asked for the same thing that he was given 4 months earlier. And it was a voluminous request, right? And then the Secretary of State's office said, that's harassment, you don't have to respond to that request. That was it though. And this guy was perpetual, like I was 2 or 3 requests a day. As they practically had one person doing nothing but responding to public records requests. One time. That's all that's been upheld. But there is the provision in the law. there's also a Public Records Assistance Fund, which was established when they first passed this law in, was it 2017, I think is when they updated the law, to help give money to municipalities to do technology to help with this, but I don't know anybody that's ever gotten any money from it, but apparently there is a fund there. And there has been a recent case to basically help clerks get people to be more specific about their requests. So as I said earlier, sometimes people come in and just make really broad requests. Like, you know, I want all of the emails for the last 10 years that have anything to do with, you know, whatever, the building department. That's a lot of emails. And so the town has a right, the record access officer has a right to say to the person, okay, look, you need to narrow this down. That's too many emails, there's not enough specifics. The building department in 10 years, not enough specifics. And the court has finally said that it's true that where the case is, where the request is too broad and sweeping, it does not have to be responded to. And if the person fails to narrow the request, even though they've been asked to, it does not have to be responded to. So you have to make an effort to get the person to narrow the request. You can't just blatantly say, I'm not answering it because it's too broad. You have to make an effort to get the person to narrow the request. If they don't narrow the request, you can say, I'm not replying to your request. But it has to be in writing, and you have to say, the law says it's too broad and sweeping, and you've refused to narrow your request, and therefore I can't respond to your request.
And that could be appealed through the state.
Well, and this is an appeals court case, right?
Right.
So, but yeah, so that can be appealed to the supervisor of records, who says, you know.
In your cover letter on the bottom, it would say, if you disagree
you have a
with
right-
me, you can appeal this.
You have a right to appeal it, that's exactly right. So that's like a broad overview of the public records law, but, you know, I think that let me say one other thing that's important. If you have a record that you think is confidential, let's say you have a report, the specifics you're not going to discuss, but kind of broadly, you have an item on your agenda that you want to talk about, and you think that report is and it is supposed to be a confidential report, right? And you refer to it in your meeting, it makes it a public record. Okay, so in the case of it's one of those W towns on route on the Pike, Wayland.
They're always W towns.
I know. So in the case of Wayland, I had Wellesley, Wayland, right? So this is Wayland, and Wayland actually had a whole host of SJC cases there for a while. There was it was a superintendent of schools, and he had his review done, and the review itself, the various parts of the review itself, was a confidential document. The final document was not eventually, it was eventually a public record, but the various aspects of it were confidential and should have remained confidential. And so they were doing the superintendent's review in a public meeting, right? And that's all okay. And then one of the members brought out the confidential document thinking it was still confidential and started referring to it, not necessarily reading from it, but referring to it. And so there was a public records request made of that document after the meeting, and they refused to give it. They said it's confidential, it's the preliminary review, it's not a public document. And the SJC said, au contraire, you referred to it in a public meeting, it becomes a public document. All right, so you do have, because there are sometimes that you have subject matters that are confidential in and of themselves, but you have a right to talk about like a broader aspect of it in public, and you should talk about certain things in public. Just be careful not to refer to any particular document that is a confidential document in the public meeting.
You can do like a hypothetical.
Yeah, right. Okay.
I'm still a little lost of when a document I guess the minute it's written, it becomes public,
Yeah,
even if it hasn't, so voting on something or whatever, I mean, it's okay.
the minute, so for all of you, the minute, let's say you get your package from Joy or Tracy, the minute you get that package, everything in that package is a public document. And if it's matters for executive session, those should be, if they're not set separately, those are not necessarily public, but I don't know that anybody ever sent,
We don't
no,
disperse that electronically.
no, I know.
When we go into, which
Right.
I understand.
And you shouldn't,
And they also get collected at the end of the executive session.
Correct, and-
so that I don't bring it home and leave it on my desk. or
that's
something.
exactly right, and that's what our advice is to everybody. I do have a couple of communities that send out a separate executive session email to their boards, mostly the select board. And I hate it, I cringe, because then it's out there in the ether, and I just know that it's eventually gonna get into the wrong hands. Not on purpose necessarily, it just happens, right? How many times have you accidentally sent an email to the wrong person, right? So,
Yes.
I know, give it back. I always like to see then, what does it say, cancel email or whatever, withdraw email, I'm like, yeah, that doesn't work, I've already seen it, right? How's that happen? Anyway, so, yeah, the minute a document is created, the minute a text, there is actually a case also, it may have been Wayland, and I don't want to badmouth Wayland on this one, it was somebody, and they were sharing texts in, there were some contentious meeting going on, and the person in the audience could see that there were like two selectmen that are like sending texts back and forth. So there was public records request made for those texts. And they said, no, it's confidential. And they said, absolutely not, those are public documents. So,
Good one.
all right,
Yeah, it was really informative.
here you
So
go.
if somebody asks one of us for a document, our canned answer should be, what you're asking me for is a public records request. And we have a process for that, set by Massachusetts general laws. Can you please go to either the town clerk or the town administrator,
Or the department head.
file a public records request so that we make sure that we
Yeah, and it does, you don't have to send them to the RAO, let's be clear, any custodian of records, you can send them to any department for the convenience of the person making the request. You can say, hey, that's an assessor's document, it's a public record, you really should go do that, and we have to keep track of it through our records access officer. So, yeah, the records access officer would be number one, but you can also send them to a department head, and the department head will take care of it through the records access officer.
And so the mindset, because I know when I first got on the board, I had this mindset, well, it's a public record, I can give it out. That's really not appropriate, because there are parameters around it that we can
Correct.
get into trouble for.
Right. You
Is
got
that
it,
an accurate statement?
that is accurate,
So that means I just can't run around passing things out,
right.
You shouldn't.
because it should go.
You gotta keep
through-
track of it, right, the records access officer has to keep track of it.
You can just say something like, thank you for the request, however, I don't have authority to
Yeah.
handle that myself. This is what you need to do.
Yep. That's exactly right.
You can't pass that information on yourself to the public request.
No, you can say to them, hey, somebody's gonna come in and make this request, I told them to see you. You can say that, just to kind of, but you can't make the request for the person, it
Right.
has to actually come from the person.
That's questioning.
I imagine you could make yourself really popular if there was a public record like as small as that email request and you gave it to the newspaper.
Oh, you can make yourself really popular, right?
So I mean, it's just saying,
Yeah.
it's really a weird dynamic.
Yeah, no, it is. I don't, it's hard, yeah. But you keep yourself out of trouble, I mean, and frankly, you don't wanna be answering public records requests. Cause you give something to some person, the other person says, well, you gave it to them, why didn't you give it to me, right? I mean, I think it's just, it's more streamlined and it's the right thing to do is to go through the RAO.
I think, personally, to keep my mind straight, I think a good rule of thumb that I use is that if it's something that we are gonna deliberate on, or we have not deliberated on it yet, then it's really none of anybody's business.
Right,
Because we haven't, because I read in the document there that I showed you, you know, something that we are gonna be deliberating on in the future, whether it be a zoning issue or anything
Right.
that we are gonna be deliberating on, as soon as you get out in public and you start talking about it, you're opening yourself up for possibly, well, Dana said that he's gonna vote this way.
right, yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I can't imagine that.
It's not a
is-
good thing.
That's not a good thing.
It's not a good position to be in.
Yeah, you know, so I kind of use that as my own measuring stick
Yeah,
on what I want to talk about, what I want to release, you know, and obviously anything that's going to be deliberated on in the future it's not a good idea to get that information out there.
I agree. And when in doubt, just ask. That's what I always
Thank
say.
you, Lisa.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Any more questions?
No.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Bill.
Could I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
Motion to adjourn.
Second,
Any discussion? Roll call vote. Dana,
Yes.
Jeff,
Jeff Walker, yes.
Leslie,
yes.
Bill DeMayo, yes. Alicia,
Yes.
thank you very much. Lisa, thanks again.
My pleasure.